Good afternoon, and welcome to another LinkedIn Live brought to you by MIRACL, the login you love. I'm Margaret Sherer, the head of marketing here at MIRACL, and today we celebrate a special day, Passwordless Day. Now, MIRACL created this day a few years ago after we realized that in May every year, people want to raise awareness for passwords. We think that passwords are inherently insecure, they're not fit for purpose, and quite frankly, they drive your customers crazy. So with that, we started this Passwordless Day on Alan Turing's birthday to help raise awareness for other solutions that can keep consumers safe while also being inherently easy to use. Today, I am joined by MIRACL CEO Rob Griffin and our special guest, privacy expert and founder and principal of Securys Limited, Ben Rapp. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Margaret.
Cheers. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing privacy and authentication, or can they really coexist? We're going to ask Ben a few questions about the authentication and privacy landscape, and then we're going to hear his top tips for businesses and consumers alike. Rob is going to jump in with any of your own questions or comments as we go. And as always, anybody out there viewing, please ask any questions or comments in the comment section on LinkedIn, and Ben or Rob will answer them as we go. Also, if you're watching this on a replay, still feel free to ask those questions, and we'll be able to answer that in live time as well. So, Rob, do you want to do a bit of an introduction of why MIRACL feels so strongly about the importance of being passwordless?
Sure, thanks, Margaret. Boy, that's a pretty hard one to jam into an introduction, given the long list of issues that we have. But I think ultimately, security is really about a sort of game of good actor versus bad actor. And after 60 years, it's fair to say the bad actors have really got to understand the many holes that exist in passwords. They've been around that long, and at this juncture, there are many flaws and possible sort of vulnerabilities are really very, very much open and readily exploitable. And so we see now that, from a security perspective, they're responsible for more data breaches really than any other single element within the security ecosystem. But it's not just that. From a user experience point of view, I saw a statistic that 17 billion transactions in the US and Europe don't happen because of passwords. Roughly, between 2 and 7% of logins fail. There are just, a whole gamut of reasons why they are not fit for purpose from a user experience point of view. So there are a raft of other issues. We'll touch on those during this chat, data privacy being right up there in the list. But the fact of the matter is they've been around for too long, and the vulnerabilities that they are manifestly kind of showing are now all too evident.
Thank you. So Ben, do you mind just doing a small introduction of yourself and your life and privacy?
My life, that would be a long introduction. I'll do a short one. I am the principal of Securys, which is a global privacy consultancy. We operate in about 60 countries. We look after privacy in large and complex environments predominantly. So a lot of our work is with large enterprises and deals with both the kind of challenges of multiple regulatory environments, both privacy regulation and other, and also some of the issues with data moving around within a very large organization. So part of the interest that I have in different authentication solutions comes from enterprise authentication as well as consumer authentication, where you often have multiple authentication events in order to do your job every day, in the same way that we all have multiple authentication events in order to live our lives.
Brilliant. So with that in mind, can you tell us a bit about the passwordless, how the passwordless revolution is affecting privacy?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things you could talk about, but the obvious one is that most passwordless solutions that we see commonly, and that's really the Apple and Google products that are out there, are still dependent on a third party who knows all about you. So if you think about how social login works, If you log in with Facebook, or you log in with Google, or you log in with Apple, whether you're using their new shiny passwordless solution or you're simply carrying their logon credential through, they know what you're logging into. So every piece of behavior that you have, every site that you go to that you authenticate using a third party that is operating on an identified basis, that third party can track what you're looking at, when you went to it, effectively when you logged out, when your session ended. And the question is, how confident are we in what they're going to do with that additional profiling information? You're providing these very large organizations who already know a lot about you and whose fundamental mission, if they're Google, is essentially to sell that information to advertisers with yet more data about your personal life. You're also putting a lot of eggs in one basket, aren't you? If you're an Apple user and you live inside the Apple ecosystem, and now you're saying, I'm going to delegate the security of other third-party applications to Apple, then you've got to hope that nothing happens that compromises that relationship. So not only you hope that Apple won't exploit it, but you also hope that hackers don't penetrate it, which is equally the argument against continuing to use passwords, but using password vaults, because then that password vault is compromised. You face the same challenge. So that's I think the core of it. It's this need for you to share identifying information with a third party in order to benefit from doing away with passwords.
And then, so going on the, a lot of eggs in one basket, if you will. Well, we know that consumers are starting to really care more about ownership of their own privacy. Can you take some examples, like where is it actually really imperative to consumer safety to know how their data is being shared?
Sure. I mean, I think it's worth just picking up on that. We do a lot of surveys in a program we call Privacy Made Positive. And we recently did a survey in the US. And one of the questions we ask is, what is it that you're most concerned about? And what's fascinating is that the second highest concern after identity theft, which is always the first concern, was people using data for purposes other than those for which they originally collected it, which is quite a sophisticated concern. And something that is also the second highest concern in most countries in Europe. So what people are worried about is that you do something with their data other than whatever it is they actually asked you to do in the first place. And probably the best and most depressing example of this comes from the dating app Grindr. They were fined for this, but what happened was that they were selling allegedly anonymized data about their users, which included location data. And that allowed a conservative charity to identify, I think it's Catholic priests in this case, who were using Grindr and therefore were assumed to be gay, back identifying them from their movements, because of course you know where the church is and you know where they live if you're in that world, and then arranging for them to be sacked. So it was a pretty poor outcome for all concerned. Grindr were fined, but the point was that there are things that we do which are entirely lawful, but which can harm us if that data is misused. And of course, that gets worse where there are things that we do that we in the West consider to be entirely lawful, but about which other jurisdictions feel differently. So if you think about attitudes to homosexuality elsewhere in the world, or to alternative sexual preferences, let's call it that, there are countries where it's punishable by death. And so the outcome of a similar hack or sort of misuse of Grindr data would be significantly worse. But if you log into Grindr using an identified passwordless solution, then the passwordless solution provider knows that you've logged into Grindr. And you can think about lots of other circumstances where there's that kind of social context to it. But then you also need to think about what people can do by understanding your financial situation, by understanding your medical situation. And again, if you're logging into your medical insurance carrier using a passwordless solution that's identifiable, if you're logging into your banking system or you're otherwise financially transacting, you are telling the third-party provider what it is you're doing. And that metadata is what really has both value and risk.
Can I just say as well, I think, so first of all, might seem like an extreme example, but it really isn't. And there are plenty I know that last year the whole issue around abortion legislation in the US saw a number of very similar use cases arise, or incidents arise. But I think the point also needs to be made that it's something where the onus sits very much on the online operator, because if you think of the repercussions and ramifications of an end user's data being exploited in that way, or being subject to a breach, those are really very severe. And it's worth understanding at this juncture, given the history of passwords, which I mentioned, the 60 years, why have they been around so long? It's because actually the issues around going passwordless, and there have been technologies, for some time, are quite significant when you consider that you've got to trust a third-party provider. And how can you do that in a way that doesn't leave you, the online operator, with a very insidious and frankly unquantifiable risk? And I think that's something that we at MIRACL have really sought to address by requiring no underlying PII for the end user. And apologies for the plug there, but that is something that architecturally we feel is missing from other passwordless providers, and that becomes very relevant when you consider that something like Auth0 or Okta, they've been hacked twice in the last 6 months, both of them. And so, to what extent is there an open liability for operators that have essentially used an Auth0 and then have exposed their underlying customers to that kind of, as I say, very hard to quantify follow-on risk.
I mean, so building on that, the architecture that you're implying to is that when, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you kind of log in with Google or log in with Apple, it's not built on what's known as a zero trust protocol, correct? And so I'm curious, Ben, if you can kind of elaborate on maybe a little bit what is zero trust protocol, and why do you agree, yes or no, that it should be imperative for modern privacy systems?
Sure. I mean, it's more about zero knowledge as well as zero trust. It's the point about this is the distinction between somebody knowing who you are and then attesting to a third party that you are the person that you say you are. So now everybody knows who you are. Mm-hmm. And somebody simply attesting that you are in possession of the necessary identifying information which you hold onto yourself in order to authenticate a transaction. So it's the difference between I have, a certificate or a key or something like that that allows me to demonstrate to a given third party that I am presently in control of this account, but they don't know who I am. And they don't necessarily need to know what I'm logging into. It is simply that the three people in this triangle, the authentication provider, me, and the service I'm trying to access, agree that there is a mechanism of exchange that will authenticate a particular instance. Is this okay? Says the service provider. Are you happy to log in? Say I say yes. And the person in the middle simply says, yes, this is okay, without knowing who I am or who's asking. And that zero knowledge situation means that there's nothing logged at the third party, at the authentication provider, that would be of use to a hacker. It means that it's much easier for me because I'm not having to provide authenticating information to that third party. Mm-hmm. So I get the convenience of being passwordless. I'm not having to give all my KYC information to a third party. I'm not leaving a personalized trail with them, but I am getting the certainty of security, provided, of course, that the third-party authentication solution fundamentally is intrinsically secure, which is one of the interesting things about MIRACL, because it's got quite a sophisticated cryptographic underpinning that means that this works without needing that knowledge of the identities of the parties directly.
And I think it's just to make it explicitly clear, this breakthrough within cryptography, which has now existed for over 20 years, has somewhat been stymied by exactly the business model that Ben set out at the beginning, which is namely, by me knowing as a third-party authentication provider, the various details of what it is the end user is doing, I can, profit from that in all kinds of ways without necessarily the end user really comprehending how I'm monetizing that data. And what we're saying is that also long term represents a kind of privacy risk that is not widely understood.
I think it's more understood than it was. And this is the interesting thing, that if you look at social login, there's been quite a lot of publicity around the implications of using it. So if we forget about more recent developments in passwordless, and you think about where it started, which was login with Facebook, and that was a pure convenience play. I'm already logged into Facebook because, of course, people who use Facebook tend to be in Facebook all the time. So I will now use my Facebook login to authenticate myself somewhere else. And the somewhere else is passing the buck to Facebook to handle the authentication. But it became very clear to people that was hugely increasing the value of their data to Facebook, because Facebook was now able to track them, including, of course, knowing when they visited somewhere but didn't log in, but that somewhere had the Facebook login option. Because when you arrive, if you have a Facebook session cookie kicking around, Facebook can now know that you've been there. So there's there has been a rise in consumer awareness because, of course, Meta, as we should now call them, have been in the news so much for other privacy issues. So I think that people's consciousness is coming. I think people are also more and more concerned about Google's behavior. I think it's slightly different with Apple, because Apple has made such a lot of noise about privacy. So, they have taken a strong stance, but their stance is a very interesting one, because it says you can trust us not to share your information with anybody else, which is actually sort of slightly asterisked as anybody else apart from all the people that we do share it with. But you also trust us to do all sorts of things with your data inside the walled garden. So Apple is a panopticon inside its walled garden. It knows everything that you do. And the idea is that you're supposed to like that and feel that you benefit from it. And I think that, I wouldn't want to claim that there's quite such a backlash against that, but I suspect there will be, because it's simply the level of insight that these businesses now have into every aspect of your behavior.
Well, with that, I guess, let's kind of turn to some solutions, I guess, first to consumers or end clients, and, that are concerned about privacy and are concerned about, do they want to be in the walled gardens or not? Are there maybe 3 tips or 3 things consumers can look for to protect themselves in terms of privacy within authentication?
Yeah, I mean, I might want to defer to Rob on this because he's the man with the thing to sell. But fundamentally, it's not really what consumers are looking for; it's what people providing services to consumers need to offer, right? So clearly, whatever login solution you're offering wants to be as convenient as possible. One of the things that's wrong with passwords is that they're a massive pain. If you have a password that is sufficiently secure that it is difficult to crack, then based on modern conventions, it's also extremely difficult to remember, because we've done a very stupid thing, right? Basically, what makes passwords difficult to crack is length. But instead of allowing people to write a sentence, we insisted that they introduce all sorts of random characters and have some capital letters. And you'll all have experienced this thing where you go somewhere and it says you have to reset your password, which is also a bad idea. And here are the 57 rules you have to meet in order for this password to be valid. And you sit there swearing as you discover that they don't think that a full stop is a special character, and you realize that they've decided that you can't have more than 3 numbers in sequence, and and this kind of thing. And you think, how am I going to come up with a password that I'll actually remember?
I would just say, the context of what you're saying is a password that's difficult to crack is a reference to kind of brute force. Whether or not that is secure, because the reality is,
that's a whole separate thing. But just in terms of what we've sought to achieve with passwords, we've sought to achieve passwords that are mathematically difficult to reverse. I'm not going to go into the maths in great detail and talk about bits of entropy because everyone will fall asleep. But in consequence of doing that, we've produced a situation where passwords are extremely hard to remember, even those that are actually quite difficult to crack. Then we do stupid things like expecting people to change them and remember the password they changed it to. And all of that leads to people failing to log in, having to do password resets, getting their accounts locked. All of this is terrible from the service provider's perspective, because whatever the transaction was that the customer was going to conduct, they're now not conducting it. Instead, they're hopping up and down with rage as they try to get access to the account to do whatever it was that was going to take them 2 minutes and generate some revenue for the service provider. So you need to move away from that. You want to have something that's intrinsically more convenient. Mm-hmm. You also want to have something that is intrinsically more secure. And that means both that it is harder for a hacker to penetrate whatever their mechanism, whether that's brute force or it's social engineering or it's a third-party compromise. And at the same time, it has to be reliable. It has to work every time, because some of the solutions that people have adopted to avoid the password problem don't work very well, as anybody who's ever dealt with a push notification in an online banking app will know. So some of the things that feel like solutions aren't. And then your excuse me, and then your third thing is that you want that privacy element. You want to know that it's not going to be misused. And that leaves us with some challenges. That we all leapt onto biometrics as obvious solution, so fingerprint or face recognition. The problem with that is that's just a proxy, right? All that's doing is providing a layer of validation that then underneath has to do something else in order to authenticate you with the remote end, because we don't actually pass your fingerprint across to your bank. Your phone is saying to your bank that the fingerprint correctly unlocked whatever it was that's on the phone that then authenticates you to the bank. And so if that underlying authentication is going through a third party like Okta, then Okta knows that you've just logged into your bank. And if Okta is penetrated, then everybody knows that you just logged into your bank. There are other issues with biometrics, which is that they're not as secure as people think they are. And they're becoming increasingly less secure as the technology improves, both with people faking faces and people faking fingerprints. But really the issue here is about what's happening in the architecture to make that authentication connection. And what you want is something that is quick, and seamless and reliable and easy for the user on the surface, but underneath is fantastically difficult to compromise. And that's quite a big ask, at which point I hand over to Rob to explain why MIRACL does these things.
Well,
you knock them down. There we
go. Rather than me go down the road of a full plug, what I would say is this: that if we come back to the original question of what should end users do, the fact of the matter is there are a series of actions that whether it be the use of multi-factor authentication or use of password managers, there are actions, but it's really, in my opinion, the wrong question, because the fact is that if you look at 95% of users online, they really consider that security is not their responsibility. And so, I could sit here and talk about actually what are the options for end users, but the truth of the matter is that 95% of people, they really think it's down to the operator. They think it's, look, I've come to your shop, you make sure that my transaction, my business here is safe, end of. I want to have a good experience. If I don't like it, I'll go elsewhere. And really speaking, not least because of GDPR, that's the way it should be, right? And so we are firmly of the view that it's now down to the online operators to really move to a passwordless world, to both enable some of the savings that we talked about in terms of just better monetization, getting rid of all of those sort of thwarted transactions, the cart abandonment, and all of the kind of benefits just from top line traffic that would ensue. But to do that, they've got to really run a thorough exercise of the different providers out there. And there's no question that the elements of privacy are a leading agenda within that. And hopefully we can set out our stall as being a provider with a clear edge, let's say that. What I would say though is that operators online care about profits, and that means they care about getting more traffic, more revenues with less costs. And time again, our case studies point to the fact that because of our login success rate, 99.9% in B2C operators, which is really higher than anyone else out there, and because of the fact that when a user gets what they want quickly speedily arriving at their destination, they don't then result in support costs. They don't then, seek to, create whatever queries with the back office. There is a manifestly substantial drop in support costs that arise from that. So we set our stall out very much on a we'll make you more money, we'll save you costs, but look, there are all these other considerations as well that you may not have considered. You're going to have to suddenly do third-party data audits if you're literally reliant on a provider that's going to duplicate all of your Active Directory. You're going to have to think about all of the kind of architectural considerations of maintaining infrastructure if you're going to run a SMS service where you're going to store all people's mobile phone numbers, etc., etc. So yeah, these are the considerations for today.
And that's a good point that you've made there. Actually, that's worth picking up on. In addition to this whole question about whether we trust this third party, what we are transferring to the third party is without question personal data as it is defined by the GDPR and the UK DPA and most of the other data protection regulations around the world. And all of those regulations also contain constraints over the export of that data to other countries.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as soon as you think about passing your email address, which is usually what you use as your username, or your mobile number, which is clearly identified as personal data, or your IP address, which is also in Europe considered to be personal data, out to a third party, then the actual service that is using this third party for authentication has a duty to ensure that that transfer is legitimate. And they have to do a whole load of due diligence, and they have to have the right paperwork in place. And it adds to the impact of using these kind of services from an operational perspective in terms of the privacy function, in addition to adding to the real risks to the data.
Yes, and the admin function of establishing that they have, hosted centers in Europe, that they have the appropriate Data Privacy Act protections and, documentation. Oof,
and the whole benefit of any zero knowledge solution is that you're not passing personal data. And that's the, from an operator's perspective, from an online service provider's perspective, that makes it much easier because I'm passing you some cryptographic numbers. I don't know who they relate to. Candidly, neither do you. The other end is passing you some cryptographic numbers. They tie up, excellent, executed authentication transaction, but no personal data moved. And from a privacy perspective, that makes it much easier for people like me to sign off on the solution without doing loads of DD and then having to come around and re-audit them every so often to make sure it's still okay.
So do you think that that's something that could be quantified from a sort of ISO maintenance point of view?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on scale, but it's clearly a part of the cost. And I think there's also the whole question then about what are the secondary costs in securing the infrastructure over which the data is moving, making sure that it doesn't represent a supply chain risk, all of that, which again, if what you're moving is purely cryptographic, you don't even have to worry about secondary encryption for it because it's intrinsically encrypted and isn't susceptible to decryption because there's actually nothing but crypto there in the first place. Anything that makes the lives of people running the privacy function easier is going to bring a cost saving. And I mean, you talked about SMS, right? SMS is completely at the other end of that spectrum. It's fantastically rubbish from a security point of view. It always involves moving personal data, and every single transaction has a significant cost. And there's always going to be a third party providing that SMS service who's going to know every time that you've texted person X. So it's kind of the worst of all possible worlds.
And what we're seeing now as well is that with the gamut of kind of brute force attacks on SMS systems, where they're essentially going for MFA fatigue for ultimately people to just accept a new identity onto the system. Those are to a large extent coming from cross-border locations. And so all of that brute force traffic is resulting in substantial SMS cost, far higher unit cost than the average domestic customer, and doesn't pertain at all to legitimate traffic. And the kind of audit process and matching, and we saw Elon Musk raise this issue with regard to Twitter and their kind of reconciliation of the SMS bills outside the US. But it's a substantial issue that people need to be aware of now.
Absolutely.
So we set out at the beginning to answer the question, can privacy and authentication coexist? And I believe we're coming to a conclusion that it can in a zero knowledge environment. And not only when you introduce that environment, do you make things quite seamless for your end users, but you also, as an operator, potentially make lots more money as far as conversions happening because more people are through your front gate, as well as saving heaps on support costs, and then potential costs as far as Ben brought up. You're not necessarily moving any data from here to there. Thus far, you're minimizing your eggs in baskets in places where you can potentially be hacked, and that creates a lot more other costs. It's been very, very interesting. So I want to thank you both for your time and going through this conversation. We will put any comments and links to the Passwordless Day toolkit for anyone out there who'd like to get involved further, so that you can share your thoughts on social. Any other questions that you might have about privacy and authentication, you can get in touch with Ben at securys.co.uk or email at info@securys.co.uk. And any questions you might have for MIRACL, please do so at miracle.com or log in at miracle.com by email. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rob and Ben, and we will see you next time.
Great. Many thanks, Margaret.
Cheers. Thank you.
And happy birthday, Alan Turing.
Absolutely.